Hope in Darkness is a podcast that addresses sensitive topics, including torture, abuse, and human rights violations. Listener discretion is advised. Josh and Thamy Holt found themselves at El Helicoide in the custody of the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, or the SEBIN, Venezuela's main intelligence agency that also functions as a kind of secret police for the government. The Holts were picked up by members of the OLP, the Operation for Liberation and Protection of the People, paramilitary types charged with cracking down on crime in 2015 by President Nicolas Maduro. Within a few weeks, government officials touted the arrest on state television. Venezuela's Minister of Interior Relations of Justice and Peace, Gustavo González López, appeared on the screen, detailing the accusations against Josh and Thamy.
Un saludo a todos los que nos sintonizan a esta hora.
A welcome to everyone who's tuning in this hour. We'd like to inform the country of the advances of an investigation undertaken by the Special Tactics Operations Unit. During a recent operation of the Operación Liberación del Pueblo, the OLP captured a subject of North American nationality identified as Joshua Anthony Holt.
Identificado como Joshua Anthony Holt, quien tenía ocultas armas y municiones de guerra y mapas estratégicos.
In addition to the grenade Thamy mentioned, he displayed photos of other items they were accused of having.
Estos sujetos guardaban un fusil de asalto AK-47, un facsímil.
Holt and Caleño Candelo were storing an AK-47, a facsimile M4, various munitions, a grenade, maps, and computer equipment in this home where they briefly lived.
González López highlighted the facts that Josh was American and Thamy originally from Ecuador, though she'd lived in Venezuela since the age of 5. He raised questions about their travel in the months and years before their arrest. He pointed out they hadn't known each other very long and implied the marriage was fake.
The supposed couple established a strange and suspicious relationship on the internet.
A los pocos meses se conocieron en persona en República Dominicana.
After a few months, they met in person in the Dominican Republic.
He said the apartment complex was a hideout for a criminal group, hinting that the Holt's proximity connected them.
They had said that I had killed some person in April when I'd never even arrived in Venezuela until June. That I was a military pilot terrorist from the CIA. I was a CIA boss sent from Obama to take down the government of Maduro.
But why? I'm Becky Bruce, and this is Hope in Darkness, Episode 3, The Venezuela Crisis.
Venezuela is a bomb that could explode at any moment.
When you turn your head, you see someone eating in their trash.
So that's when we start seeing the government postponing elections.
Venezuelans have the right to express their will in a peaceful and a democratic manner.
To better understand what happened to Josh and Thamy Holt, you have to go back in time and learn more about how Venezuela became what it is today. It's a bit of a history lesson, but the context becomes very important. A note, what happened to Venezuela is complicated, and we can't explain all the nuances of its decline in just this one episode. We also aren't experts on Latin American politics, but we did reach out to a few people who are. That's after the break. Venezuela didn't start out the way we've been describing so far. A narrow strip of verdant mountains separates the city of Caracas from the Caribbean Sea. Tourism videos in the 50s and 60s enticed visitors with tales of vibrant city life and epic scenery, a paradise just a flight away. Tropical resort islands like the one Josh and Thamy visited on their honeymoon dot the coast. The country had a lot going for it.
Venezuela is a beautiful country. Caracas is a beautiful city.
That's Laura Gamboa, an assistant professor of political science at Utah State University, an expert on Latin American politics, and a native of neighboring Colombia.
Venezuela was the most long-standing democracy in Latin America, right? I keep telling this to my students. When I grew up in Colombia, people fled to Venezuela. It was never the other way around, right? They were seeking peace and security and prosperity.
But it didn't last forever because
a lot of that success was built on oil money.
And as long as the government had plenty of money from oil, things were great for Venezuela.
But in the 1980s, there are two things that happened. One, Latin America in general sees a recession that destroys economies across the region. And second, oil prices are not as good as they used to be. And so the government no longer has the money to fund everybody, which is what was happening before.
And the people who drew the short straw, Laura says, are always the same. The poor, the low income, the less educated, and so on.
And so they were in a situation in which the economy is declining and representatives are just not doing their job. Democracy is not delivering. So people just gets ready to throw the baby, the bathtub, the water, everything.
Enter Hugo Chavez, the son of two teachers. He went to military school at the age of 17, then became a communications officer. That led to the creation of his Bolivarian movement, starting the units he commanded. Chavez named his revolution after Simón Bolívar, a 19th century Venezuelan leader who played a big role in liberating much of South America from Spain. Chavez was inspired by Bolívar. His movement focused on national pride and socialist ideals that he saw as a way to fix corruption and inequality. His first attempt to seize power was a military coup that failed in 1992, but established him in the eyes of the downtrodden as someone who would fight for them. He went to prison, serving 2 years, and then re-emerged on the political scene just in time for Venezuelans who felt marginalized to rediscover him.
Porque el pueblo venezolano no es un pueblo de cobardes. ¿Quién dijo eso?
Right? And vote for this person who had just not less than 10 years before launched a coup against a democratically elected government because he was promising he was going to solve the situation. Even if that meant putting in power somebody that may risk democracy.
En Venezuela tiene su hora, y es que llegó la hora del pueblo.
Thamy watched it unfold.
Él supo de forma astuta.
He knew in an astute way how to win over poor people. Venezuela is a country of middle class, lower middle class, and very few of the upper class. Obviously, the upper class was going to vote against him. But there were more poor people. He went to the poor people. I'm going to give you a house. I'm going to give you medicine. I'm going to give you food. I'm going to give you a car. If he did this, people were going to go for him because they were going to get things. The other candidates offered jobs and jobs and jobs so that you could earn money and buy things. And a lot of people didn't like that because that would take years. But there was someone who was going to gift you something. What did the people do? Go for the guy who was going to give them things. Because there were a lot of poor people, he won.
Entonces, como eran muchas personas pobres, sus votos, él ganó.
So Chavez came to power in 1998, largely on the vote of the disenfranchised. And right away, his government started building projects. Things like housing for people displaced by natural disasters. Except they weren't available to help everyone.
The difference between what Chavez did with think about welfare is if we're thinking about welfare, usually what we think about in Europe or like the Scandinavian countries is programs organized by people who have studied about housing or health or education or whatever it is and have figured out how can we make this money benefit the most amount of people. That's not how social projects were thought of during Chavez. That's not the way they're thought of today. The way these resources were distributed had an electoral logic behind. The idea was, we're going to build buildings that would get us votes.
By the way, that didn't always result in the most quality of structures.
Because building a good building could take more than an election cycle. And so if it takes more than an election cycle, it's not going to work for us. So they're built as fast as they can, right? So literally, I've seen pictures of buildings that had sinks that were upside down. I've seen pictures of houses that are cracked in the middle. And the problem is, the people who are receiving these things had so little to begin with that a building with a sink upside down is better than what they had before.
The strategy gained Chavez a lot of followers, Chavistas.
They were supposed to be all about turning Venezuela into a socialist paradise, though, right? I mean, and the emphasis was on the paradise.
Brigham Young University professor Kirk Hawkins is also an expert on Latin American politics.
That it was going to be a country with, broadly shared wealth. There was a hope that it would be spread out, that the oil wealth would be enjoyed by everybody, the government would become clean and fair, and that it would operate really on behalf of all Venezuelans and not just the wealthy.
The problem was that wealth never really got shared the way Chavez promised. There was corruption at multiple government levels. Things continued to become more and more unfair.
Venezuela's democracy began backsliding, but it was still a democracy, an increasingly flawed one, but a democracy nonetheless. Up until 2006, 2007, when Chavez had finally taken over every single state institution.
That's everything from Congress to the courts to broadcasting licenses and, yes, the Electoral Council.
And so by 2006, really, Venezuela had elections. The opposition was allowed to compete, but it was allowed to compete in a situation in which it was really hard to defeat the incumbent.
Kirk saw this in action when he lived in Venezuela doing research.
So a typical example, I remember in 2010 when I went down to see the legislative elections, I was really shocked at how many government buildings had election advertisements for Chavez tacked up to the outside of them. Something that, we would say that's wrong. Government agencies don't get to campaign on behalf of anybody, but they did. And it was really evident. It was everywhere. It was pretty surprising.
But the people still had a choice, to a certain extent.
There was actually still a lot of fairness to it, but you could already see signs of this kind of authoritarian creep.
It got worse after the death of Hugo Chavez in 2013. His handpicked successor, Nicolas Maduro, took charge as expected.
The elections under Chavez, including his own presidential re-election, it was a mostly fair victory. I mean, there was advertising, unfair advertising in his favor, and government resources would have been used for his campaign in ways that were illegal. But even with that, he beat his opponent pretty handily, and the voting on election day was probably fine. Since then, under Maduro, that's changed a lot. So no one has any confidence now that a count would be fair, that the government wouldn't just make up numbers. No one thinks of Venezuelan elections as credibly democratic anymore. They're not free, they're not really competitive.
Y al punto en el que ya Maduro llegó.
And at the point that Maduro arrived, that was the first time it was shamelessly an electoral sham, because it didn't go to him. It went to other candidates. That was the first time. And then it continued and continued and continued.
Elections weren't fair. Corruption was rampant. And bad economic policies started to add up. It became very difficult even to find food.
And the only way to find cheap food is the one distributed in government grocery stores. And so if you want to buy in those grocery stores, you need to have your card that shows that you're a member of the government party.
In 2016, there were a series of riots over the lack of food.
These can be massive. We're talking about like opposition organized protests all over Caracas or outside Caracas more commonly too. Or they can be just local fights over lines, right? And who cut in line or who didn't. Or I've been in line all morning and sorry, the food is over. More like localized type of riots and stuff like that. But that happens when you have a lot of people who are in need.
One of the first documented reports we could find about food riots was dated May 15th, 2016, about a month before Josh landed in Caracas. An opposition leader addressed the crowd of protesters.
Venezuela is a bomb that could explode at any moment. We don't want the bomb to explode. And because of that, we call on everyone to mobilize in favor of a recall referendum in 2016.
At the same time, inflation climbed out of control. Wages couldn't keep pace.
I actually made the math of what a minimum wage as of October of last year was in dollars, and it's $7 a month. And the basic food basket costs $189 a month. People just don't have the money to buy anything.
Thamy, who lived in Venezuela most of her life, saw it firsthand. She had the means to get food when it was available.
It's not like here, you go to the market, you took whatever you want and go back to your house. No. So I just need to go to the line and make a huge line, like 1 mile line maybe. And I get food.
She also remembers seeing people rummage through the garbage.
When you turn your head, you see someone eating in their trash.
They're hungry.
Yes.
People were starving, and they were dying because they couldn't get their needs met in other ways.
You have to think of what happens in a country when suddenly nobody can get medicine anymore that they need. You know, what if you have diabetes? Or you can't get insulin anymore? What's going to happen to you? Well, you might not live, and it's going to be a painful death. And what happens if you get a cut and a little infection, and there's no more antibiotics anywhere? Well, you might die from your infection.
When Laura lived in Caracas in 2014, life-saving medication, even for conditions like HIV and epilepsy, were hard to get.
I met a person who needed a knee surgery. He had been in an accident and his knee was shattered, like he couldn't walk. And the hospital said, yes, we can perform the surgery, but you're going to have to bring in the supplies. And by supplies, I mean the saline, the needles, the tubes, the screws that we're going to use to rebuild your knee. You're going to have to find all of these and bring it in. It took him 3 months.
My sense is a lot of people have died there from treatable, avoidable things.
And on top of that, the fact that people that are malnourished, that cannot get the food they need, well, chances are they're going to get sick way more often than people who are well-fed.
Tensions were starting to boil over. That's after this. Today's program is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the all-in-one daily drink to support better health and peak performance. Even with a balanced diet, it's difficult to cover all your nutritional bases. That's where Athletic Greens will help. Their daily drink is like nutritional insurance for your body that's delivered straight to your door. I used to take a handful of different targeted vitamins every day. I feel like I've been able to upgrade my daily vitamin regimen by getting rid of all the pills and drinking down one Easy Green shake instead. It's good to know Athletic Greens is NSF certified for sport, meaning it's consistently tested and audited to make sure what's on the label is actually in the pouch. Plus, it tastes good. Whether you're looking to boost your energy levels, support your immune system, or address gut health, now's the perfect time to try Athletic Greens for yourself. Simply visit athleticgreens.com/hope to claim my special offer of 20 free daily travel packs with your first purchase, a $79 added value. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/hope. All-in-one nutrition in 75 highly absorbable ingredients. By 2014, just a year after the death of Chavez, people were very angry over shortages of food and other goods, inflation, and increasing violence. Protests erupted in the streets. Clashes between students, protesters, and the government resulted in thousands of arrests and dozens of deaths. Tensions with the U.S. were on the rise, too. Venezuela's government ordered 3 U.S. diplomats out of the country in February 2014 over accusations they were inciting violence. At the end of that year, U.S. lawmakers approved sanctions on the country in response to human rights violations. Those sanctions got expanded in early 2015 through an executive order from President Obama. It targeted individual Venezuelan leaders considered responsible for those human rights abuses, barring them from entering the U.S. and freezing their assets. The U.S. even declared Venezuela a security threat. A chilly meeting between President Obama and Nicolas Maduro took place in April, as reported by ABC's Arlette Saenz at the Summit of the Americas in Panama.
Prior to their meeting, Maduro extended an olive branch of sorts to the president while also saying he could not be trusted.
Yo quiero creerle. No tengo confianza.
I respect you, but I don't trust you, Maduro said of President Obama. If you want to talk, let's talk. If you don't want to, that's okay.
The sanctions did nothing to help the shortages of food on the ground in Venezuela and are seen by many as amounting to U.S. support for opposition leaders, who managed to win a 2/3 majority in the Venezuelan parliamentary elections that year. That was a huge blow to Maduro and his government. Good news for freedom, right? Not exactly.
This system is no longer functioning for the government, it's functioning for the opposition, but not the government. And so what ends up happening is that the government decides to get rid of elections altogether, right? So that's when we start seeing the government postponing elections, or if the opposition manages to win, creating new bodies that would effectively take over the power of the bodies the opposition controls. So, for example, the opposition controls the Congress, so the government came up with this bogus National Constitutional Assembly that takes precedence over Congress, and they crack down on the opposition a lot harder.
By the summer of 2016, Maduro declared a state of emergency, and the opposition called for a recall election to remove him.
That's when we start seeing people getting shot in the streets. I was reading a report this morning. We're talking about 500 people who have been disappeared. We're talking about selective killings. That's when we start seeing full-blown repression. Venezuela is today the second most authoritarian country in Latin America. The only country that is more authoritarian than Venezuela is Cuba.
All of that is to say, Venezuela was already very much in crisis long before Josh got there, and things were pretty bad right as he arrived. But the question remains, why did government officials detain Josh Holt?
Unfortunately, Josh's case isn't unique, although it is unique in the sense that in this case they picked an American citizen to target. They've certainly done this to plenty of Venezuelans, including people in the opposition, and even ordinary Venezuelans. If they decide that someone in the street in a bad neighborhood is causing problems or there's a score to settle, they'll just plant the evidence and take him and throw him in jail, and sometimes throw away the key as well.
Josh landed in Caracas on June 11th. On June 14th, 2 days before he got married, then Secretary of State John Kerry addressed the Organization of American States, a regional forum, sort of like a Western Hemisphere-only United Nations. Its primary function in recent years has been monitoring elections. In that speech, Kerry called on Venezuela to release the country's political prisoners.
To respect freedom of expression and assembly, to alleviate shortages of food and medicine, and to honor its own constitutional mechanisms, including a fair and timely recall referendum that is part of that constitutional process.
Was this speech a catalyst for what would happen on June 30th? It's hard to say. But in the course of producing this podcast, we found that government video broadcast in Venezuela shortly after Josh and Thammy's arrest. The implication was that Josh was a spy, an American agent sent to destabilize Maduro's government.
Bajo distintas fachadas, los servicios secretos de Estados Unidos.
Under different facades, the secret services of the United States have tried to use methods of unconventional warfare to meddle in our affairs. They encourage the formation of these criminal paramilitary groups to destabilize the objectives conquered in the revolution.
Desplazando objetivos conquistados en la revolución.
We played the video for Laura. As propaganda goes, she said, it's pretty effective.
And there's people who genuinely believe the story, at least in a little part, because it has happened elsewhere.
She's talking about U.S. intervention in multiple South American countries over the last century or so. During the Cold War, United States leaders saw a threat from the rise of populist and socialist governments in South America. They worried that more Latin American countries might follow Cuba's lead and expel foreign powers and become allies of the Soviet Union. This intervention took a number of forms. Americans trained Guatemalan troops in a civil war that resulted in thousands of civilian casualties. The CIA supported Chile's Augusto Pinochet, a general who overthrew a democratically elected Marxist president, only to establish a dictatorship of his own. That regime was later blamed for at least 3,000 murders and tens of thousands of human rights abuses. There's also at least some evidence that the U.S. knew or approved of a coup attempt that resulted in the temporary removal of Hugo Chavez in 2002, short-lived because his loyalists quickly restored him to his position. At multiple points in the years following, the Chavez government, and more recently the Maduro government, have accused the U.S. of more attempted coups and even attempted assassinations.
Entonces ya para 2010, ya todo lo que pasaba en Venezuela era culpa de Estados Unidos.
Around 2010, everything that happened in Venezuela was the fault of the United States. If there wasn't food, it's because the U.S. didn't let food in. If there wasn't money, the United States was ensuring our money wasn't worth anything.
No valga la pena.
It made being an American in Caracas a potentially risky proposition. Laura had a brush with this herself in 2014, during the onset of the anti-government protests.
One of the things one person told me was that I was in a very precarious situation because I was a political scientist from a U.S.-based institution who was Colombian. And that if I got caught, they would parade me as a right-wing fascist CIA agent. And you had enough information to make that plausible.
So it wasn't too difficult for the Venezuelan government to depict Josh as a possible American infiltrator in its propaganda.
No permitiremos que los intereses oscuros del capitalismo,
we will not allow the dark interests of capitalism, supported by these criminal paramilitary groups, to undermine the stability and peace of our country. Nor will we allow that this unconventional war foment hate and disdain toward the leaders of this Bolivarian revolution. Nor will we allow attacks, occupations, and displacements of our successes and conquests, of our people, our fatherland, destined always for independence.
De nuestra patria, destinada definitivamente a la independencia.
He dismissed the U.S. as a whole, denouncing American ideals and culture, and Josh specifically.
El estadounidense Holt ha dejado evidencias.
Holt, the American, has left a lot of evidence in his social media pages about his love of guns, typical of the culture of many Americans, whose country makes and distributes more weapons than any other country in the world, and where acts of terrorism for racial, homophobic, and religious reasons are common.
Terroristas por razones raciales, homofóbicas y religiosas.
In 7 minutes, you have shown that there is an American living in a place where nobody would expect him to be living in. You have drawn enough suspicion over him to make him a credible CIA agent with all sorts of half-truths and bogus information. This is a media coup.
Both Laura and Kirk see Josh's arrest as being somewhat convenient for Venezuelan officials.
I think he was just kind of a bargaining chip. They saw him as an hey, here's somebody we can hold here, and maybe there will be a nice moment to let him go. And we can just use him that way. That's my awful concern is they treated him that lightly. He was just a sort of a pawn that they could use for this.
We caught this gringo, and then we're gonna paint him as a CIA agent and God knows what else. It's great propaganda.
One of the details that has gotten very little press that we learned while researching Josh's story is the sheer volume of people who have fled Venezuela. It's been happening over the last 20 or so years, but the exodus ramped up in 2016 and 2017.
More Venezuelan citizens have fled the country seeking essentially asylum elsewhere, as have fled Syria.
The Syrian civil war displaced some 6 or more million people within Syria, and another 5 million to other countries. It got much more attention in the news than the situation we're describing in Venezuela.
That's become an enormous challenge for countries around them.
Colombia has received more than 1 million Venezuelan refugees. And they're crossing the border with nothing, literally nothing.
I mean, this is a lot of people that have left the country. Millions of Venezuelans have left the country.
We're talking about 5 million refugees, roughly speaking. We're talking about a country that has decreased by 10%. We're talking about the largest refugee crisis in history in a country with no war. And by far the largest refugee crisis in the history of Latin America.
We asked Laura whether the state of affairs in Venezuela is a story about socialism or about abuse of power.
I do think that Venezuela is a story about a strongman, an authoritarian government, and not a story about socialism. Because honestly, really what is going on with the economic policies in Venezuela is not that they're for welfare. The problem with economic policies is that they're aimed at gain voters, not at creating a welfare state. And you can put that or not, but I strongly believe it.
Thamy feels a sense of loss for her former home.
It's sad, but the government, they are destroying our country.
Next time on Hope in Darkness.
So I remember taking all of my clothes off other than just my underwear and just laying on this disgusting brown pad thing that they gave me. And I just knew, I was like, okay, you know what? 45 days, I can do this.
Hope in Darkness is written and produced by me, Becky Bruce. Additional producing and editing came from Nina Ernest. Sound mixing by Trent Sell. Our executive producer is Cheryl Worsley. Original theme composed by Michael Bondmiller. Additional voice work provided by Rebecca Cressman and Alex Curie. Special thanks to Josh and Thamy Holt and their family for sharing their experiences and story. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Hope Darkness Pod or online at hopedarkness.com. And your feedback is always helpful. Drop us a rating or review wherever you listen. Hope in Darkness is a KSL podcast.